Hello, my name is Hannah Finch, and I am a second-year law student at Penn State Law. I am currently participating in the Manglona Lab for Gender and Economic Equity. One of the lab's projects, Witnesses to Herstory, is concentrated on capturing the personal experiences of women in sports, education, and the workforce, focusing on the 1960s and 70s. Today, I have the privilege of interviewing the internationally renowned advisor on genetic and reproductive technologies, bioethics lawyer, and professor, esteemed Lori Andrews. Welcome, Professor Andrews.
Thanks so much for having me, Hannah. It sounds like a great project.
So to start, you were born in Chicago, Illinois of what year?
I was born in 1952, and various experiences along the way have gotten to me where I am now, which is as someone who assesses the impact of emerging technologies on individuals and relationships and communities and social institutions like insurance and employment and the law.
And when you were growing up, who lived at home with you growing up?
My parents lived at home and my younger sister. And, when I went to school in the 1960s, girls were often put in different classes than boys for skills training. And, girls went to cooking classes and home economics and sewing classes, and boys went to shop where they actually made things, so creating future engineers of the world and so forth. And I know my mother got annoyed at one point when they were putting girls in typing classes and went to school and protested so I didn't have to take typing. Well, hey, that would have been one of the most useful things now that we're all in the computer era. But at the time it was channeling women into secretarial jobs and so forth.
So when you said that your mother challenged it, what do you mean she challenged about it? What was she going against?
She refused to have me take typing. She went to the school and said, let her study something else.
Did you want to do something like shop that you weren't able to access?
You didn't even consider it at the moment. I mean, the most hilarious thing was I did win the Betty Crocker Homemaker Award. I cannot cook at all. I couldn't then, but it was a written exam. And so my dad thought it was hysterical that, since I could sort of do any written exam, that I'm the Betty Crocker Homemaker of the year for that year. And my younger sister, who was a stand-up comedian years later, when I got married, told my then husband, why don't you put your desk in the kitchen? That way Lori will never bother you when you're working, since I'm not at all interested in cooking.
Oh my goodness. And how did that make you feel to have to take this course and then you got this title?
You didn't question it at that time. You really didn't. Now, some of the other things in my life I questioned. When I was 10 years old, my Ken doll went bald, and I wrote to Mattel and actually wrote a complaint letter at 10 years old. And so they sent me another Ken doll head. So that kind of led me on my path to consumer advocacy, to have a real win when you're that young of, complaining about something and getting results. Also, when I was 10, I had an amazing experience. I went to a public school, not in a rich neighborhood. And by dint of the personality of one teacher, Lucille Peller, she started a program where she took kids who were bored at school, and because they did their work so quickly, and took them out of their regular classes every afternoon from 4th to 8th grade and put 4th through 8th graders together and taught us a whole bunch of things you don't usually learn in school. So we learned how to make Disney type cartoons. We played music. We could write reports about anything we wanted to. And I remember as a kid writing about P.T. Barnum and the Vietnam War and archaeology. And so we were doing research papers as little kids, 4th through 8th grade, in a big class together. And then we'd take advantage of cultural things going on in Chicago, the puppet opera. And once a year, we'd take a trip someplace else in the United States, all funded by spaghetti dinners sponsored by our parents. So this was like a low-cost thing, but really starting me and making me feel through my entire career. I love writing. I think learning occurs outside the classroom. And, that one person can make a huge difference.
And
And
when did you start that program? Well, like when
when
did
I
you
was
start
10,
participating in that program?
yeah, fourth through eighth grade.
So what year was that?
Um, so 1962,
Okay.
for
And
5 years.
when you were going to your elementary and middle school education, did you notice any differences in the demographics of your classes? Were there more girls to boys or more boys to girls?
No, no.
And did you notice any differences? You said you had seen differences in the classes that were offered. Were there any differences in the like the extracurricular activities available or the sports available to each gender?
Um, you know, I was more interested in something like modern dance, and so one might think of that as a more traditional women's activity. Um, and I'm sure, I mean, I'm sure there were, like, all the way through, even by the time I got to college, women's teams at Yale had to practice in, like, the parking lot of the football stadium instead of in the stadium, and had to swim at really odd hours of the night or really early in the morning because the prime hours and the prime locations were accessible to men. After high school, I went to Vassar because I had read so many amazing things about Vassar women who became diplomats and authors and surgeons and so forth. But when I got to Vassar, it was the first year they admitted men, and so that was the fall of 1970. And men were given all the great positions, head of the radio station. They started talking about having more pre-med because now we have men. And since men were being privileged over women at this traditionally women's school, that's when I decided to transfer to Yale. And I arrived at Yale in the fall of 72 to a big banner on the main campus saying 1,000 male leaders a year, because they promised the alums that they would still graduate 1,000 male leaders and just admit women at the margins, maintain the same class size for men. And there were real issues. Not enough women's bathrooms, sometimes none in classroom buildings. And even some of the younger male professors, for example, I was taking a experimental psychology class, and a professor that was not that much older than I was at the time, a man, so it wasn't a stodgy older white male, it was a young white male, said to me, women don't make good experimental psychologists, out of nowhere. And that sort of lack of confidence in women makes you lose confidence yourself, because you're thinking so hard about how to prove this person wrong that I actually dropped a mouse at that point that I was holding on to.
Was
So,
anyone else around to hear that too?
it was just common. I mean, in my calculus class at Yale, I'd been really interested in being a math major. I was fascinated by math. In my calculus class, the professor actually said, "What's the woman's view of this issue?" As if women and men approach formulas differently, or there could be a different answer. I mean, there are lots of areas of the world where we might want to ask what's different between men and women. They have different immune systems, and so forth, different, different responses to illness, different types of illness, and so forth. But there's not a gendered approach to certain mathematical things.
When you were going to school, you said that you had transferred from a school that was traditionally like geared towards females and transferred to Yale, which seems to be more male centered. How did that feel to like experience that drastic of a change?
Mm-hmm. Since I'd been at a co-ed high school, it wasn't like people who come out of, single sex education all the way. So college was more like what I was used to. I found the faculty members in general very open and it was a very exciting time intellectually. And I think that being in the minority and sometimes having to fight for your place there, has helped me afterward. My second year in law school, I worked for a Wall Street law firm that had one female partner only. It had male receptionists and male secretaries. So being there was, some women at Yale Law School did not interview with that firm, even though the New York Times called it the Rolls Royce of law firms, because, they were uncomfortable being so outnumbered. But since I'd already gone through that when I was 19, it was not such a big issue by the time I got to law school and my work after law.
And when you were first starting, what was your kind of breakdown of your professor demographics? Did you have more female professors or more male professors?
There was only one female professor at Yale Law School at the time.
And what about administrators? Were there any female administrators?
I don't recall. Undergraduate, there was a female. There were female administrators.
And
Heather Gerken, who is now I think, first female dean of Yale Law School, points out how when she went into her office there for the first time as dean, she realized that that the stained glass windows, which are like a history of law, only showed negative things happening to women, like women were witches, burned at the stake, and so forth. So, it is has been an old boys club for a long time.
I know that Title IX was enacted in 1972. Did you see any influences like that this might have had on your school directly?
It was still very, very hard for female athletes to get access to any of the tools males athletes had, and any of the time, on the rink, in the field, and so forth. They had to practice in really obscure places, like parking lots and so forth. So it did not make a huge difference, even when women's teams were outperforming the men's teams in terms of national awards and so forth.
Wow. And did they bring this to the attention of any administration or try to make change directly? Were you aware of any movement?
Of course, but it didn't work. I was in one of the first classes that went all the way through Yale, so they hadn't really figured out, the female issue yet, and they also hadn't, we're having problems with alums quitting donating and so forth because of this decision to admit women.
You said that you had problems with access to facilities like the restrooms. Were there other places where you felt
or like clubs like Maury's, you couldn't become a member of this club that is sort of right on the Yale campus, and lots of social activities occur there. And I remember at the Yale Club of New York, I had to sit behind a screen in the lobby because women weren't allowed to be seen in the lobby of the Yale Club of New York, even though you were a Yalie.
How did that make you feel that they were kind of erasing you from visibility?
But, on the other hand, it teaches you a certain skill set. I'm glad it's changed, but it makes it easier for you to stand up for yourself in a whole lot of other situations. I got a great education at Yale. I loved the other students there. They were really smart people who were also nice. So, the bottom line is, I had some, an amazing experience there. And certainly discrimination was occurring much more rampantly in other settings. If I'd gone to work as opposed to getting a degree, I would have faced even bigger hurdles than I did there.
When you say that, do you have any like specific examples that come to mind of people that you know had experienced
Outside of college or inside of
in
college?
the workplace?
Oh, of course. And even today, I see some of my female students. So in the 2020s, which I know is further than your timeline, um, in the 2010s, women getting jobs in big firms, like my top patent student who'd won all these international awards and who was a woman, went to a firm and they wouldn't give her any patents to draft. They gave them all to the men until they had a bra patent. So, she quit over that.
Wow. And did she ever speak with you about how that like made her feel, or did she try to talk with anybody about it?
It's who do you talk to? It's if the partners are all doing the same thing and are on board, it's hard to, unless you're going to sue, to actually confront it, one-on-one. It takes, women getting into, you more places of authority who can provide help to those who are coming up.
And speaking of taking on some litigation, I, in my own patent class, have learned about your case with Myriad. And I wondered if you could touch on that and how you got started on that case.
Sure. So I've done a number of pro bono cases throughout my career that had to do with new technology. So the first time was a case in which a couple wanted to get their embryo back from an in vitro clinic because they'd moved and the clinic wouldn't give it back. So that was an interesting case because I'd never gone to court before, and yet nobody else had worked in this area or written about embryos. And so the clients came to me and said, you're the only one who could do it. And so I'm doing my first case, and the Wall Street Journal's there, and PBS NewsHour sort of under a big light of attention. And so we won that case. But it, really, I confronted a lot of issues about the doing public interest cases where maybe a winning argument for your client might be bad for women in general. I had to get co-counsel in Virginia, and I had a male co-counsel, and he said, well, why don't we just name the embryo and file for kidnapping? And if you think of that, if you make the embryo a person, you'll do away with any reproductive decision-making rights the woman had. So we ended up going forward on other grounds. And then I did a pro bono case where involving in vitro fertilization. So there's a law in Illinois passed right after the first in vitro child was born in the world, Louise Brown. And it said, if a doctor fertilizes a woman's egg in a petri dish, that doctor has custody of the resulting embryo for purposes of the child abuse statute. So no doctors in Illinois would do in vitro because we know what child abuse means for a child, nutrition, education, stuff like, but what does it mean for an embryo? Not all embryos become children, and could you be charged with homicide if your embryo didn't? And so in that case, we argued that women's right to privacy covers the right not just to not have a pregnancy, but also to have a pregnancy. And that was, really important to me because having had the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, allowing the right to control over when you timed your pregnancies, many women were, by 1980, postponing childbearing and then finding that their fertility had fallen off. So it was important to me to fight for reproductive rights, and this was one way we did it. As a footnote, though, you can see where the in vitro right might go away too if it's based on the same right that Roe v. Wade is based on. And so that interest in reproductive technologies led me to write a book in 1984 about genetics, and that led me to being named the head of the ethics advisory group to the Human Genome Project. So I got involved in those issues, looking at the impact on women of things like, if you learn you have mutation in your breast cancer gene, do you feel like you have a time bomb inside you? Even though in many cases you will be fine. The risk is perhaps a 30% chance that you will later get breast cancer. And then should your employer or insurer be able to take you, a healthy person, and require that you're tested for the breast cancer mutation, and not give you a job or insurance on the very slim chance that you'll get breast cancer later on. And so part of what I did was, help write a bill that was introduced in Congress, and it took like 17 years to get it passed, but protects healthy people against discrimination based on a gene mutation that might affect them later in life.
And you also helped with the protection of that with your case in Myriad by protecting it against patent.
And so, the next issue that really caught my attention was the fact that human genes were being patented. And so starting in late 90s, I got involved in a case that was a challenge to a patented gene, and it ultimately led me to work for 13 years on a pro bono case to liberate the breast cancer gene, because I saw the impact on women. If a gene is patented, the patent holder has a monopoly on it and can charge whatever it wants for the genetic test. Myriad was charging $3,000 for a test that could be done for $30, but women had no choice but to go to Myriad. And also, you couldn't get a second opinion. So women were being told they had a mutation, and some were having their breasts removed even though they were healthy, to prevent later breast cancer. They couldn't find out whether that was a false positive or not. And also scientists at other institutions who were doing research on breast cancer were shut down by the holders of the breast cancer gene patent. Were told they couldn't do research on it. So it was just sort of bad all around as a public policy matter, but it took many, many, many years to get it heard by the Supreme Court, and then the court unanimously said genes are products of nature, they can't be patented. Interestingly, I've been making that argument for the past 15 years, and male patent lawyers would actually say to me, "Oh, little girl, you don't know what you're talking about, and you can't rely on these decisions from 100 years ago," which of course, actually withstood the test of time and were cited by the Supreme Court in the case.
And how did it feel to have kind of that adversarial relationship with all these other male patent lawyers in relation to this idea that is kind of commonplace now?
So I was used to it because I've been in so many controversial areas, like reproductive technologies or whatever. There have been, my whole career has been sort of like that, with male doctors. I remember being at one of the national meetings of infertility doctors, and the doctor said, I was speaking about genetic screening of sperm donors and other screening of sperm donors. And this doctor said, "Well, I didn't screen my wife before I married her. Why would I, screen a sperm donor?" But you marry a wife for a lot of reasons. A woman whose husband is infertile and comes for a sperm donor does not want to get hepatitis or have a child with a serious genetic disease. There are, that's more like a drug where you need to know about safety. So I, you know, I'm used to it, let's say, and so it makes it all the more interesting when it, in winning these things, you know.
And when you were going through this process, did you have any role models or kind of mentors throughout this process, or any confidence in you were able to talk with about these kinds of things?
So I had a male mentor at School of Public Health at Yale when I was in law school, who had a more international perspective, and we did some projects for the World Health Organization once I finished law school. And so this excessive commercialization tends to be a US phenomenon more commonly. And so having someone who had a broader worldview was extremely, extremely helpful. But even, no matter how much experience I would get in these areas, there was still often a desire to have a male lawyer be the one, leading the public policy charge. And so I think about my early days as a young lawyer writing about reproductive technologies. And there was a side benefit to my interest in new technologies, which was if I'd gone into a traditional field like estate law, there would have been thousands of male lawyers senior to me. And the areas I went into them at the time that not very many people knew about them, wrote about them, could analyze them. And so it ended up, 2 years after law school, I was at the first international meeting of doctors and scientists from around the world giving a speech about in vitro surrogate motherhood. There had been one in vitro birth at the time. And so I was on the forefront of a number of things, and it made me the person that sometimes, like Ghostbusters, who do you call, that people had to call because, mine was the name on every article and every interview in the New York Times. And so when the National Group of Infertility Specialists called me in the early 1980s, a few years after I was in law school, and I'd by that time appeared in Congress talking about infertility. I'd written a book about reproductive technologies called New Conceptions. I had done articles, and they needed a speaker for their annual meeting. And so they called me and they said, surely there's some male lawyer you can recommend for this speaking slot. And so, I thought about it, and then I sent them a letter, not a cranky letter, but a letter that said, okay, there are these 3 male lawyers you could contact, but make sure they can answer the following 25 questions. And then I put like, if the child of a sperm donor seeks to find the donor father, can that be done? And, many more questions. And they couldn't find any male lawyer that could answer all those. So they came back to me, and they weren't even sheepish about it. They said, oh, could you speak at our meeting? And then they said, could you Golda Meir yourself up a bit and explain? But what they meant was not look so young and not look so pretty.
Why do you think that they wanted you to do that?
I guess they couldn't find it credible that a young, at that time, pretty lawyer, actually knew something.
And how did you react? Like, how did you respond to them?
I spoke at the meeting because it's another thing that becoming a lawyer, gives women. certain groups just have to listen to you because they're worried about malpractice. They're worried about whatever. So you can get a lot of policy made just by the fact that from your position, you're intimidating or have a certain degree of credibility.
Was there ever a time where you felt like your gender kept you from being received well? Do you think that it kept another person from taking the advice that you were giving?
Um, I think my advice was pretty much taken. I've got the whole infertility world to change what's in their consent forms and things like that. Once people heard me, because I wasn't a giggly sort of person. It's clear I was serious along the way. I remember when human reproductive cloning first became a possibility, and I got a call from the Clinton White House to advise them on the legal issues of human cloning. If I clone myself, is that my twin or my child? And if can the clone inherit my estate? And is it bigamy if you marry two clones? A whole, is it criminal if I take a lock of Bill Gates' hair and clone him and sue him for child support? So there were a lot of issues. I wrote a 113-page memo about a whole variety of issues there. And then got an email from the government of Dubai to come advise them about human cloning. And I didn't know what to expect, but when I got to the airport, the chief of police picked me up. Well, and I could hear him saying to the visa desk my name and saying, "When this gentleman arrives, call me at once." And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm this, short blonde in a blue pantsuit, and this is gonna be a really big surprise for him. So, there are still parts of the world and still situations in which it's unexpected that a woman will show up. But I think, once I'm there, I'm pretty effective in my role.
And what year was that where you went to Dubai?
Let's see, 1992.
And then I do want to take a few steps back and head back towards your childhood a little bit. Talking about your parents, what did your parents do for work?
My mother did not work outside the home, although she was very smart. And I bemoan the fact that she and her sisters stayed home after they had kids, because they were all seriously smarter than their husbands and could have run the world. So that's a real loss, I think. And my father was a pharmacist.
And did they reach that decision on who would stay home with the children together, or did you think that that was just kind of assumed?
I think it was assumed throughout society, the early 1950s. Think about any of the movies there, the nuclear family,
Is that also what you saw in your friends' families and things like that?
absolutely.
And how did your parents divide the household responsibilities?
Um, my dad was actually super enamored of my mother. So they were a good model for, a head over heels relationship. But, he worked 12 hours a day. And so that left her to, do most of the housework.
And were there any like strong female role models in your childhood growing up that you relied on?
Well, my mom was if she was willing to go to school to get me out of typing class, and she was very anti-authoritarian, and also felt like, hey, you could be anything. So that was a super, super strong role model. And in fact, I dedicated my first of my 14 books to her, because of that ability to make the inconceivable seem conceivable. And then there's also, though, that teacher, Lucille Peller, that created that whole program on her own that really led to, opening up the world to kids from ages 10 to 15. It made it very boring to go to high school after that.
You said you were allowed to explore any kind of material, correct?
Yes, absolutely. No holds barred.
Was there anything that you focused on specifically when you were in that?
So each of those reports I did was on some completely, different subject. I mentioned archaeology, the Vietnam War, P.T. Barnum, all of that, but they were long, they were well researched, teed me up perfectly for college and law school and putting myself through, college and law school writing for newspapers and magazines. So, so I did a lot of public policy stuff about, even things like who gets to use psychiatric excuses in murder cases. What about the use of psychosurgery? But I also wrote when I was little about whatever interested me. So I wrote, jokes that were printed in Archie comic books, and wrote for American Girl magazine, which was a sort of teen magazine in early days, about a trip I took to Spain when I was 16. And so I started publishing things, quite young. In fact, when I was 10, I published something. So
I'm sorry, could you say that for me one more time?
No, products were not available in school.
Gotcha. And did you ever talk with your male peers about menstruation or sex education and health?
No. And it's an era before the internet, it's not an era where you get much information about anything,
And eventually, once you were a little bit older, did you begin to date at all?
Yes.
And what did that look like? When did you begin dating?
Well, hey, little boys on the playground in kindergarten used to bring me rings. And I made my mother go to school and have them stop kissing me. So does that count? um, so I was dating in high school, and I have always had, like lovely men in my life. So I've not had a history of abuse or abandonment or anything like that. I always had people who wrote me poetry and sent me flowers and composed songs for me. I mean, it was, from my high school days up through now. So that, was not an issue. I'm sure the era in which I grew up was one in which, there was violence within homes that was never taken seriously and so forth. But, gratefully, it didn't affect people I knew.
When did you first get married?
I got married when I was 29.
And what year was that?
1981. And so prior to my getting married, I would travel the world and advise different governments and be at meetings of physicians and scientists. And then when I got married, one of the scientists turned to me and said, I guess we won't be seeing you anymore. Because I'd gotten married, he just assumed I would, my husband wouldn't allow me to do these sort of things. It was as if I'd got an incurable disease as opposed to getting married. So there still was, in the early 80s, kind of that weird expectation, when clearly, the person who married me was interested in my, my career, and, it made me more interesting to him. And even though we're not together, he still will read a draft of every article I write or brief and offer me, aid on it. And we get together, we're great buddies. So it was odd to think for that to be the assumption. And I remember when I had a child, I have one child, a son, and one of my good male friends said to me, "Now listen, Laurie, your mother might try to get you to stay home with Christopher. Do not do that." He said, "If you put all your focus on your child, he'll grow up to make Woody Allen look sane."
And when did you have your first son?
I had my son when I was 35.
And this was what year?
1988.
And
And so I think that, the view that learning does not occur in the classroom, that one person can make a real difference. I think that that has animated my son as well, and his traveling like around the world, the conferences and other things, has made him comfortable in a whole bunch of different cultures.
had you always wanted to get married? Was this something that you had always kind of planned on doing?
No. And I also sort of super respect women's decisions about whether or not to have children. So that wasn't necessarily in something that I felt like I needed to do. Oh my God, getting married, I eloped. My cousin had taken a year off to plan her wedding. I didn't have time. So
And how did everyone react to you telling them?
um you know, yeah, as I mentioned, some of the male scientists I worked with assumed I was like down for the count then and wouldn't be traveling internationally to conferences anymore. I don't know why. I didn't change my name. I'd already written like 9 books by that point. I told my husband he could change his name if he wanted because I had this, brand. It. I think my parents would have been happier with a big, wedding, but this was more in keeping with our life.
Did you see any kind of similar adjustment or change in attitude when you announced that you were pregnant?
It was interesting to me that the bigger thing came like with marriage, which you don't think it should, because, and I was very far along in my career, even though I was only 35 when I had my son. I mean, interestingly, my boss's secretary had a dream that she had to carry my baby because I was too busy. So my boss's secretary dreamed that she was my surrogate mother. And yeah, I worked up to like right the last minute of giving birth. The Today Show called me in the recovery room to see if I could fly in the next day to be on it. And, I wisely refused, even though they said, "Oh, we'll give you a limo with, dark windows so you can breastfeed in a limo." And, but, things just keep happening and going on. And, and I must say some of the medical meetings were better than the legal meetings in terms of having childcare available. For example, when I spoke at a meeting in San Antonio for infertility specialists, they actually had a quite well thought out program where you could bring my son was maybe 7 at the time, and they had all these super cool activities. They brought animals from the zoo over. They had, all these different learning experiences and fun things. So, I mean, that is a big, big problem if you, the childcare issue is huge.
What kind of childcare availability would you experience within the legal field then?
Yeah, I mean, that was not part of the equation. They didn't, have that readily available.
So that wasn't even an option.
Right.
Gotcha.
You know, I'm not quite sure how it is now, but I don't think it's gotten that much better. I mean, it was such one positive effect of during the COVID pandemic was that at least they were making more childcare available to healthcare professionals. But that's something that, we really have to work on to create a less discriminatory society. I when I was writing about internet privacy and internet companies at the time that, Facebook and Google were starting to offer egg freezing for women. So to pay for you to freeze your eggs, which is sort of a super incentive for you not to have a child and to keep working and all this with this hope that this will all work out later on. You can have a child. One of the big tech companies had doggy daycare, had special pizza places on campus, fitness, egg freezing and all that, and they didn't have childcare. Well, that's the way to fix this issue of, the fact that overwhelmingly the top positions in tech are filled by men.
And
it isn't, it's gotten more rosy in some ways, but there's still real issues. And since I spent so much of my career dealing with emerging technologies and where the struggle was to figure out how should we regulate it? Should we just do a disclosure that it's being used on you? Should we require that it be, for example, with genetic testing, should you be told every time, you're, a life insurance company say wants to do genetic testing? We have laws that say you shouldn't discriminate, so let people get that information, but not let them use it in negative ways? Or should we just ban certain things? And that's come up with every technology disclosure, regulate, ban. And so I was really working for appropriate frameworks for technology. And it might be a need for access when you didn't have it, like in vitro being cut off for not appropriate reasons. Or it may be, in some instances, to ban something like human cloning, because, everybody in Chicago, once cloning was possible, talked about wanting to clone a famous basketball star, Michael Jordan, but, pity the clone of Michael Jordan who wants to do ballet instead of basketball or breaks his knee at 10 and seems useless and so forth. So, some I want to facilitate access, some I want to stop inappropriate access. But I hadn't really focused, surprisingly, until past 5 years on the differential effects on women and men of technologies. And so most of my work now is about that. I'd done some pieces about it along the way, but technology was widening the gap, making things more different, making things riskier for women in a lot of ways. So until, here's another example of a single person making a huge difference. When Dr. Florence Haseltine in the early 90s joined NIH as a doctor, PhD, she realized that they were doing all their research on male mice, that there were more veterinarians than gynecologists. And even at a recent look, 3% of the NIH budget is spent on specifically looking at women's issues. So she learned that technologies were being created that were actually harmful to women. Like a shunt might be developed, tested only on men, actually be fatal if you use it on women's hearts. So, and even today, most medical technologies are tested on men and more than on women. And 80% of the drugs taken off the market, it's because of harms differentially affecting women. So we have those technologies, medical technologies being developed without enough thought to women. And then, speeding up to recent things with AI, which is being touted in some quarters as avoiding discrimination, actually is worsening discrimination. It turns out that help wanted sites on the internet are 6 times as likely to direct men to higher paying jobs than women. And AI is being increasingly used in screening people before they ever get a human interview. So Amazon, one of the biggest users of AI in the world, it can tell me what book I'm going to read next, or, and it uses it to reduce its carbon footprint and so forth, decided to use AI on screening employees. So they asked their engineers to develop an algorithm that gets us more employees than our top people in the company. But the top people in the company are men. And so think about what's on their resumes. They might have been football team leaders, or been, had other been in the army, things that men tend to do more than women. And so what happened was the algorithm was developed, and then it bounced all these qualified women, because even if you had something like national women's chess champion, co-captain women's soccer team, some positive thing, if you use the word women, it threw you out because it was trying to find more people like the top ones. Another company used an algorithm and similarly trained it on men, and it told them to hire people named Jared who played lacrosse. So these computer assisted technologies are also kind of enforcing stereotypes about women, and so setting us back instead of helping us go forward. I mean, they're also likely to lead to people who are less innovative, because if you want someone like same old, you may not get fresh ideas. And surprisingly, it turns out it's better for companies' bottom line if they have women as well as men in top leadership. Another thing is that women have gotten into more male-oriented jobs. In fact, 30 women are joining the Air Force for every 24 men. So, and yet flight suits don't protect women against G-forces because they're designed for men's bodies. And they also don't unzip far enough to fit the female bladder device. And so some women get dehydrated before, don't drink before they go on a mission, which can cause them to black out and so forth. So it's it's a horrible situation. And even in traditional, not traditional, but formerly male jobs where there are a lot of women, like in the police, the things designed for men don't work, like bulletproof vests. You would think, okay, that'll be fine. But it turns out because of women's breasts, they ride higher, and women are getting shot and knifed under the breast in ways that men wouldn't. So there's this whole, across medicine and transportation and the workplace and communication, women are being disadvantaged and sometimes put at high risk because of technology. So in this stage of my life, I'm working hard to get something of a women's moonshot in technology, to say what technologies can we design that would make things more accessible to women, less discrimination. And also, it turns out a lot of these technologies would be very good for men. I mean, in the military, they are now, because women can't lift as much, they're now designing these exoskeletons. Women in the military are designing them, so to help carry things. And that's obviously going to benefit both women and men.
When you were first entering the legal field, did you experience any kind of, I guess, adversarial nickname?
Male lawyers would call me a lawyerette. So that happened. And also, I mean, there's just a huge amount of sexual harassment too. And in fact, after the Me Too thing, a woman who was maybe 10 years behind me at Yale wrote about her experience when she was early on a reporter at the Wall Street Journal and other things. And, and she would, she would go to interview CEO and he'd lock his door and take his pants off. And she's like, we didn't know to call that Me Too or sexual harassment. That was just going to work. And that idea struck me. You'd have to sort of brush through just a lot of innuendo, or particularly since I did a lot of work where I was on the road or at meetings and all that, I'd be the only woman on a committee, and like 4 of the male committee members individually would call me or show up at my hotel room after the meeting. So that.
And
So,
how did that make you feel that they would do these kinds of things?
Well, it's another way of minimizing women, or just being diluted, like Harvey Weinstein was, in terms of saying, oh yes, these was all consensual, all these women actually wanted me. Its negative impact is it is offset if you can competently do your job and get your ideas across and so forth. The way it creates barriers is if it's put as an excuse to not allow you to do your job. Like, oh, I can't send a woman on a trip because it might turn the eye of our senior partner. And certainly there are institutions, and even former vice presidents who feel that way,
And do you feel that you experienced any kind of different kind of frequency of those kinds of events versus when you were married and unmarried?
No. I mean, there was no sense that I'd become some other guy's property, and so you should lay off. We're being at one ABA meeting where, I get introduced. It's a national meeting of lawyers. I've obviously been asked to give a speech, and the person introduces me and says, oh, she can hardly see over the podium, like she's so cute or whatever. And I could have rudely said that one of the ABA past presidents, a male who'd spoken before me, was virtually as short as I was. But rather than having malice in my approach, I said, just pretend I'm the Wizard of Oz and you can't see me, but you can hear me, because I'm about to tell you some really important stuff. So.
And so you've published numerous works, and many of which talk about the impact women experience. And do you have any next steps that you think that we should be taking for us women entering the legal field as you were earlier in your career?
Well, I mean, find something you really love. And I think there are some advantages that I've had in thinking about what are the legal questions that are going to come up next in whatever field that you work in. Certainly, publishing things makes a big difference. There's at least a certain amount of authority it gives you, and interesting people, contact you and like minds and get asked to do further projects. So, I mean, it really was to my advantage when the National Academy of Sciences would then contact me and put me on a committee, because I'd be in the room with scientists and you'd hear like a bioethicist say, well, this isn't going to be a problem because we're never going to be able to do that. And then a scientist would say, well, I did it in my lab last week. So I think these interdisciplinary things can be very useful to your career, because you can get a perspective on where a field is going and what the likely legal issues might be. I mean, I think there are many more channels for women to report, unsavory things that have happened to them. I don't mean like full out sexual harassment, but even just, the day-to-day taking of women less seriously. So I think we can shore up those institutions, find a group of women we respect that we can, of all ages, that we can spend time with, mentor others. There's a lot of, and just have faith, as my whole career has taught me to do that. Like a single person can make a difference. You don't have to just like leave the field. You can make it better.
And we've talked about a lot today. In light of all of your experiences, what makes you most proud of your younger self?
That I took myself seriously, and that led others to take me seriously as well. I was really willing to fight, even at personal cost, for things I believed in, and that I raised a son who that's good in the world and is at the top of his craft as well.
And as this interview comes to a close, I'm excited about the impact sharing your story will have on our audience and allow us to continue this conversation.
Thank you so much.